not too great an event for me. But subsequently, when I joined, this organization, it was quite an exciting opportunity for me. So within 3 years, I realized that if I need to continue with that, I either need to go to the US or continue, I take an LLM there, write the New York bar in order to practice more, or I could continue in litigation. So I again went back to litigation in 2008. And from 2008 to 2015, I did a variety of
2000.
cases. Did I hear someone saying something?
No, sir, you may continue.
Okay. Yeah. So from 2008 until 2015, I again went back to litigation and I was practicing basically in the High Court of Kerala and in Chennai, Madras High Court, and as well as appearing before various tribunals. So during the course of that period, I have represented one of the largest hospital groups in India, which is Apollo Hospitals Group, and I was also a member of their ethics committee. And in 2015, UExchange was one of my clients when I was in my litigation practice. And in 2015, when they asked if I would be interested in joining them in their headquarters in UAE, I didn't want to miss that opportunity because corporate experience is something, which you need to have. And that's when I decided to make a move to UAE. And that's when I came here. So in 2015, when I started off, as a director of legal and corporate affairs, and subsequently I got a promotion. Now, coming to the topic of a role of in-house legal counsel, again, it's my personal view. One of the most important things I've realized is my litigation practice helped me tremendously in terms of moving into a corporate role. Because what is a corporate role? The corporate role, when you talk of a corporate role, how do you differentiate this from litigation or a regular law firm? So an in-house counsel is a jack of all trades, but a master of none, which basically means that you do a variety of things, but you don't achieve mastery over anything. So that's something which is very key for you to understand, that you don't become a master if you go to a law firm. So let's say you pass out and you join a law firm, a corporate law firm. Let's say an Amarchand Mangal Das or a Zia law firm. What you would be primarily focusing on is, if you're doing M&A, you'll only be doing an M&A. If you're doing capital markets, you'll only be doing capital markets. If you're doing general corporate, you'll only be doing general corporate. If you're doing IP, you'll only be doing IP. If you're in litigation, you'll only be doing litigation. So that's how a typical law firm works. Okay. And you don't you get you definitely you'll become a master of that particular subject, but you don't become a jack of all trades. So in-house counsel, that is the biggest advantage you will get. You get to do a variety of subjects, but no mastery. Obviously, a lot of it relies on external law firms as well. Okay, so that's what it does. So what do you actually do sitting in a company? You are a business enabler. So as a lawyer, when you practice in a law firm, everything is a risk for you. You try to minimize the risk. You don't take risk. What you do is, in a contract, if you guys have gone through contract drafting, you will see that every clause is very important. And you know uh, uh, a dispute could happen with each and every clause. But what an in-house counsel does is, if an in-house counsel tells his boss that we cannot do this contract because this is the risk, how do you do business? So you tend to become a business enabler rather than a business blocker. Whereas if you're a lawyer, you tend to be a business blocker. So that's a difference between a lawyer and an in-house counsel. So how do you determine what is important, what is a risk, and what is not a risk? So that is where I said my practice helped me tremendously to understand what is a risk appetite which I can take. And the risk appetite is not just about me, it's about the organization as well. So if the risk is for 1,000 rupees, I wouldn't care. But if the risk is for let's say 1 million, yes, I would care a bit. So based on that, that's how we handle corporate matters. Now, coming to what my role was, I was handling a variety of matters. For example, I was involved in regulatory matters. So we come from a financial sector, financial industry. So in the financial industry, you must be aware of, you must have studied your corporate law, and you must be aware that if you want to start a company, you have to file your application with the registrar of companies, and then you can do business. you can immediately start business. But it's not always so that you just set up a company and you can start your business. So let's take the case of the financial services industry. In the financial services industry, let's take the example of India. If you want to start a bank or a non-banking financial company, is it enough that you just set up a company and then start trading from the next day? No, that is not sufficient. What you will have to do is you'll have to go to the RBI, which is basically the financial services regulator in India, apply for a license, do a lot of formalities. I'm not getting into the formalities because it's quite a bit and it's tedious as well. You apply to the regulator and take the permission and start the business. So this was one of the areas which I was focusing on when I was with the company. So we had operations in more than 30 jurisdictions, direct presence in more than 30 jurisdictions, and combined with another group company, we had operations in more than 40 plus jurisdictions, plus an indirect, presence in more than 160 plus countries. So it was quite a challenge because the moment I joined UA Exchange, the first assignment which was given to me was for a change of control in all these jurisdictions. Now, what is a change of control in the financial sector? So, you know, in the financial services sector, there's a lot of due diligence being done by the regulators on the ultimate beneficial shareholders. So, what is an ultimate beneficial shareholder? An ultimate beneficial shareholder is someone who holds the shares in the ultimate company. So, you will have a company sitting at the bottom which actually does the business. There could be a holding company on top. There could be a series of companies on top. And ultimately, there will be two individuals who hold the shares in that company, two or three or four or five individuals who hold the shares in that company. Those are the ultimate beneficial shareholders. Okay, so the regulator does a due diligence on all the holding companies, its directors, and ultimate shareholders. So the first task which was assigned to me, without even knowing anything in the financial services industry, was for this change of control. Because at that point in time, the company was going through a change in control, and that was what was assigned to me. I wouldn't say it was easy. It took me almost a year and a half to complete that process because that's how long it takes. Some regulators give it within 4 months, some regulators may take 6 months, and some regulators may take more than 12 months because they keep asking questions about the financial viability, about business plans, about risk and governance. So when you get deeper into it, you will understand. But yeah, I wouldn't say it was quite easy for me to understand these concepts initially and move on. But that is where my litigation experience helped me because it gave me a head start in terms of understanding the laws. Because when you're a litigation lawyer, you do a variety of subjects, particularly in the civil and criminal areas. So it's easy for you to understand. So just passing out of law school, and if you intend to join a corporate, it may take you more time to to understand that. But rather, if you are spend a little time in litigation, understanding the court process, understanding the various strategies adopted, because your court, what is written in the books is not what is practiced in court. It is a completely different ball game. So we may strictly go by the law, but when it comes to evidence, when it comes to cross examination, and when it comes to interpretation, I'm sure you would have done your interpretation of statute, it's a completely different ball game. So that is how I started off. And one of the primary focus areas at that point in time for me was, the agency business which we were handling. The agency business is nothing but, you know, we provide the systems, we provide the technology, we do everything, and then we appoint agents in various jurisdictions, for them to receive and send money. So, for example, if you're sitting in US and you want to send money to India, you go to one of our agents in India. I'm not talking about the branch business, but an agency business. You go to one of our agents in India. So the agent logs into a system which is owned by us and given by us, and the man pays in the money. The money is deposited into our account, and we do the transfer internally to India. So there's an agency business, there's a branch business, there are a variety of business which was handled by us. So how our legal department was structured subsequently was, there is a general counsel. Under the general counsel, you have five departments. One is a corporate secretarial team, which is basically the company secretary and team. They take care of board meetings, board matters, shareholder meetings, etc. Then you have uh, guys who are handling the agency business. So, I'm sure many of you would have heard of the word Express Money. So there is a team for handling that business, the legal side of that business. Then there is a regular team to handle the UA Exchange branch business. And then there is a team which basically does data privacy. So data privacy is a very big thing and it's an emerging area of law. Data privacy team is there. And then there is, you know, the transaction advisory and IP team, which basically does everything else. So I was handling one such department, and one of the primary focus, couple of, I'll tell you what exactly I've been doing. I've been doing regulatory activities. I've been doing mergers and acquisitions. I've been doing IP activities. I've been advising the internal legal departments, IT and infosec teams, marketing, finance, treasury, you name it. The rest of the thing was directly under me. So, coming to the fact, what is the primary thing you would need to understand when you go into a in-house role? Of course, you need to read and understand the laws, which is on one side. But what do you get to do on a day-to-day basis? On a day-to-day basis, you will have contracts coming in, a lot of contracts coming in, which you will need to review. Obviously, one of the rules of an in-house counsel is if you have to review those contracts, you have to understand what is the risk involved in it, and then advise and get it signed. Obviously, if you're going to appoint an external counsel for reviewing these contracts, what is an in-house counsel's role? You know, there is no role of an in-house counsel. So one of the most critical things in the role of an in-house counsel is how to draft a contract, how to negotiate, how to structure a contract, and how to negotiate a contract. Obviously, for complicated transactions, for mergers and acquisitions, where there is no in-house expertise, you obviously rely on external counsels. But typically, 90% of the contracts are done in-house, unless it is a transaction involving multiple jurisdictions like an acquisition, etc. So, have you guys done contract drafting? Classes on contract drafting, or are you aware of it?
Okay. They have done classes on contract law, but they haven't done practical courses on contract drafting yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, what is a contract? I'm sure most of you would know, all of you would know because you have done your classes on contract. How do you structure a contract? If you see, I'm not sure if you have a document. Sushma, do you have you seen actually how a contract looks like?
I'm not too sure of that. Maybe some of them who've gone for competitions have seen contracts, but the others might have their familiarity with contract would be limited to contract law itself, rather than to an actual contract. Yeah, of course they've seen the standard contracts that you see at the back of every. Other than that, they haven't seen the big value contracts. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not getting into anything complicated, but let me give you a very simple example of how a contract would be structured. Let's say company A wants to buy something from company B, and company B agrees to, sell it for a consideration. Okay, you know the elements of a contract. I'm not getting into it. So how do you structure it? So how do you structure it? First is would be when do they intend to bind themselves to the contract? So your first line would always be, this contract is entered into on such and such date. Then you have, define the parties. You define who the parties are to the contract, party A, party B. Then you define. So there is something called a preamble to the contract. A preamble to the contract explains the intent behind entering into the contract. So, for example, party A wishes to buy XYZ from party B, and party B agrees to sell it to party A on terms and conditions as defined in this agreement. So, that's how a preamble typically looks like. Okay. So, what you do is you structure the contract in such a way, then you have, you list out what is being sold, what is the consideration received, what are the representations and warranties, what are your, there are typical boilerplate clauses in a contract. How do you, explain that? So what are boilerplate clauses in every contract? You will see that there are some standard clauses like jurisdiction, uh, you know waiver, notice, entire agreement clause. So Sushma, I would rather make it interactive because I'm not sure how many of them will understand this.
Yeah, I'll request them. Students, if please feel free to join in and ask questions.
Yeah, because
Bec-
because otherwise it'll just be a talk, a monotony without,
yeah,
a
yeah,
monologue
yeah.
without anyone being able to understand what I'm trying to say. So when I'm structuring, please feel free to interrupt me and ask me questions, and I'm always available for that. So when you structure a contract, so there are some basic ingredients to a contract. Your legal course would have told you the basic ingredients of a contract: offer, acceptance, conditions, being able to be legally bound. But how do you put that in a contract? So, like I said, the party name of the parties, the preamble, what is being sold, what is the consideration, the representations and warranties. Now, what are representations and warranties? Now, company A is representing that it is actually an incorporated entity. I'm just giving an example. Huh? There are many other representations and warranties. Company A is actually representing that as an incorporated entity, okay, and that it has power to sell, a product, okay. Maybe company A would have been defunct 10 years back, okay, and they may not have the power to sell it. So by including these representations and warranties, the other party is protecting itself from any future liabilities arising out of this transaction. So you will have standard representations and warranties, then you have indemnities, then you have limitation of liability. Now, what is an indemnity? An indemnity is nothing, uh, you know, if I'm buying something from you and you are agreeing that you have a right to sell that to me, you are indemnifying me for any losses which I suffer arising out of that activity. But at the same time, I can limit my liability to a certain extent. To the extent of the purchase price I have paid, liability can be limited or unlimited. So it all depends on how you want to negotiate and structure a contract. Now, what is critical, what is not critical? Before that, let me tell you also about the boilerplate clauses. Standard clauses in a contract require, standard procedure requires that you have certain, very basic clauses in a contract. For example, dispute resolution and jurisdiction. Now, if there is a dispute, how do you determine? Of course, you can go by your CPC, but typically in business contracts, you typically have arbitration because of the value of, the money involved. If it runs into millions of dollars, you wouldn't want to go to court, pay your court fee, and fight for a number of years. So what you do in such a scenario is you typically prefer that first you go for a mediation. A mediation is nothing but to both the parties or their senior personnel sitting together and trying to figure out how they can resolve it. Typically, some cases get resolved through mediation, but if that doesn't happen, the next step the companies would adopt, through that dispute resolution clause would be arbitration. So arbitration, you're free to decide your governing law. You're free to decide, where the seat of the arbitration should be. You're free to decide whether it should be one arbitrator or three arbitrators. You're free to decide on the procedural law. Now, when I talk about the procedural law, there's something called the procedural law and substantial law when it comes to arbitration. The procedural law is nothing but the procedure which governs the arbitration. So, for example, you have the Arbitration and Conciliation Act in India. You may have, arbitration rules of the ICC. You may have arbitration rules of DIFC. You may have arbitration rules of, the Abu Dhabi Global Market. So there are a variety of procedural rules relating to arbitration. So you as an in-house counsel can decide which rules will apply to the procedure for the arbitration. And the procedure for arbitration is nothing but where you decide this is the procedure I'll follow in terms of appointment of arbitrators, how the arbitration should happen, when the claim should be filed, submitted, etc. Now that is the procedural aspect. What is the substantive aspect? Substantive aspect is which law governs this contract. So I may decide on ADGM arbitration, that is Abu Dhabi Global Market arbitration rules, but I am free to decide. That's a procedural aspect, but I am free to decide which law governs this contract. I can decide on the jurisdiction of England and law of England and Wales to govern that contract. I can decide on ADGM laws to govern that contract. I can decide on UAE laws to govern that contract. So this is very critical how you draft it, because obviously you guys know that you cannot confer jurisdiction, or when two parties, when there is no cause of action in relation to a particular jurisdiction, does the law of that land apply? So these are all practical things which you will encounter when you are drafting such clauses. So these are typical boilerplate clauses in a contract. And there's something called a superseding clause. What is a superseding clause? A superseding clause is nothing but, if there is some prior agreement between you guys and someone else, by entering into the latest contract, all those rights vanish. The contract which you have at present is what is sustainable. Any prior agreement, any prior contract which you have entered into vanishes into thin air, and you stick to the present contract. So you cannot rely on parole evidence and say that, oh, he had told me that at that point in time. No, that is not applicable. So these are all very, very critical matters while drafting a contract. Again, it all depends on your risk appetite, what you're willing to take. So how do you negotiate a contract? So, let me give you an example. Um, for a typical M&A transaction, okay, from a legal aspect, what is most critical would be your representations and warranty and the indemnities associated with it. Now, let's say there is a case for which the company is liable. I'm intending to purchase XYZ company, and XYZ company is involved in a litigation, let's say for an amount of 1 crore. But my purchase price for the transaction, let's say, is 200 crores. So 1 crore litigation which the company is involved in, if it loses, it may, give away that 1 crore. You may lose that 1 crore, but my purchase price is quite high. So would 1 crore would be such a concern if you're, going to lose the 1 crore subsequent the case happens, is a thing which you will want to think about. So how do you classify? You classify the risk as red, amber, and green. Again, the way I follow is I classify it as red, amber, and green. Red is something which is non-negotiable. Amber is something which I may or may not give up, and green is something which is good to have. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. So for me, the 1 crore litigation would not be much of a concern. I would put that in the amber list. But for someone else, my boss would say, why do you have to waste 1 crore? Let's put it in the red list. So when I talk about indemnities and warranties, I am asking them to indemnify me from any litigation or any losses which I suffer because of this purchase. Because after I purchase it, and if I lose the case, I may have to pay the 1 crore from the company's pocket. So for that, they would say that, they would disclose something. So indemnities, when I make a representation warranty saying that when the company makes a representation warranty saying that there's no litigation, there is nothing which affects us, and makes representations like that, we are indemnified because you are representing that there is no case against you. We may be aware there is a case, but you're completely saying that there is no case, there is absolutely nothing. And if there is something like that, we will indemnify you. So if tomorrow I lose the case and I have to pay that 1 crore, the seller company will have to give me that 1 crore. So that is how an indemnity, representation warranty indemnity works. But let's say they say, when I put that representation saying that there is no cases against the company, they're not lose, etc. They say that no, there is one case of 1 crore. We are disclosing it to you right now. If you do not, so we are disclosing it to you right now so that tomorrow if you lose, you don't come after us. So then we start negotiating. We say that, we cannot accept that as a disclosure because it's an amount of 1 crore. So then there are two options remaining with us. Now, if we put it into the red list, we tell them, no, this is not acceptable to us. We cannot take on this liability for this 1 crore. So then what do? You negotiate. You negotiate not to take it out of the red list and put it somewhere else. No, you negotiate to see how you can manage it. So then there may be a solution, okay, that, okay, we will take this disclosure from you, okay, but at the same time, 1 crore would be paid to you. If I have to pay you 200 crore right now, I will not pay you 200 crore. I'll give you 199 crore. Let the 1 crore be retained with us. As and when the case is decided finally and a judgment of the final court comes in, okay, if we lose, you don't get the money. But if we win, we will give the money to you. So that's a concept called staggered consideration. So how you define all this is that you define it as red, green, amber. You can do whatever you want, but that is where the concept of risk appetite comes in. How much of a risk are you willing to take for the organization? Some risk, maybe it's very minimal. We won't even, We will argue it. We will argue it for the sake of arguing so that you get something else. You don't stop arguing on a point just because you think it is irrelevant, because you may have 10 other points which you may want. So you keep arguing on this and finally give in so that they give you something else. That's how typically a negotiation happens. So in my role, this was one of the very critical things in the role of an M&A, as a role of an M&A lawyer. This was one of the very, very critical things which I used to handle: negotiation. And negotiation may sometimes take, days. It may take 1 day, it may take 2 days, it may take a week. So what we do is, at the time of negotiation, we go, you know, book a conference hall, you know, morning till evening, we sit there. Sometimes it goes late into night, and we finish it off. And don't think, in-house role is like a 9 to 6 job. There are many organizations which have a 9 to 6 role, where they rely mostly on external counsel, keep lawyers for the sake of keeping a lawyer, just to advise them. But typically, large organizations, in-house counsels have a very, very important role. So in the case of an M&A, we don't go and how does an M&A happen? You want to buy company A, you have to do due diligence on the company. Now, what is a due diligence? A due diligence is something which lets you know what is the financial health of the company, what is the legal health of a company, what is the tax health of a company. You wouldn't buy something knowing something is a rotten apple. So that's when you have to do an initial due diligence. How does an M&A transaction typically happen? So it happens typically when you get an information memorandum. An information memorandum is, let's say, Tata wants to sell one of their companies to Birla. So, what wants to sell one of their companies? Let's not look at the purchaser, just look at the seller. So Tata wants to sell a company. So Tata prepares an information memorandum with very basic details. So the information memorandum will contain, details about their financials, their projections, very brief statement, maybe 1 or 2 pages. So that information memorandum may or may not be, given to a few people, but based on discussions, uh, you first what the first step what you do is, okay, and Birla says yes, I am interested in looking into this company. So what Birla and Tata will first do is they will enter into a non-disclosure agreement. Now, what is a non-disclosure agreement? A non-disclosure agreement is basically a contract in which two parties agree to share certain details with each other. Once you start sharing they agree that they will not disclose these details, to the market or to anyone else. So that's very simple. What we will take information from you, but we will not disclose it to anyone else. It is purely for, the purpose of getting into a further transaction, but this details will be purely kept within us. Now, in a non-disclosure agreement, there are various, rules about what to include, what not to include. I'm not getting into it. I'm just giving you the structure. So first thing is, what you do is get into a non-disclosure agreement. Now, once a non-disclosure agreement is signed, the next step is to, you know, either start discussing, arrive at a tentative purchase price, etc. Okay. Then what you do next? That is when you start entering into a term sheet. A term sheet could be binding or non-binding. Let's talk about a non-binding term sheet. A non-binding term sheet, reaches, is a result of parties discussing with each other and arriving at a purchase price based on the information memorandum and discussions after the NDA. So you arrive at a purchase price of, let's say, 10 crores. Okay. So it is non-binding solely because of the reason that you still haven't completed your diligences. So you enter into a non-binding term sheet saying that, okay, I agree to purchase your company, but subject to various reasons. What are those reasons? Subject to completion of my diligence, legal, financial, tax diligence, and there could be a lot of other diligence as well. Subject to getting all corporate approvals, because how do you acquire a company? You have to take your corporate approvals, your shareholder approvals, your board approvals. So there are a lot of factors involved in it. So subject to all these conditions being satisfied, I will enter into a share purchase agreement with you. So that's how a non-binding term sheet looks like. Then you actually come into the diligence. Diligence, like I said, it's primarily, in our Indian context, it's primarily three. One is legal, one is financial, and one is tax. Now, let's say it's also a technology company, there'll also be a technology diligence. Let's say it's some other company, there'll be a diligence based on that. But primarily, the most focus area would be these three things: tax, financial, and legal. Now, the diligence may throw up a lot of red flags. Uh, you know, legal diligence may throw up, the fact that they have multiple litigations in multiple forums. It may throw up the fact that you are being investigated by the regulator in a number of jurisdictions. So that is clearly a red flag. And there are cases, there are situations. So there have been instances where we have actually not gone ahead beyond the diligence point, because there was a lot of regulatory red flags, there were a lot of legal red flags. So there are cases where the legal issues are minor and which we can easily clear once a transaction is over. So diligence always throws up red flags. A legal diligence can throw up red flags about the number of litigations, the volume involved in it, the regulatory issues involved, the labor issues involved. So that is what a legal diligence does. So in a legal diligence, what happens? I engage a law firm. I tell them I want a deep legal due diligence, on this particular company. So the lawyers from my law firm will go and sit in a room filled with documents provided by, now it's all online as well. But typically what happens is, they will provide a data room. It can be physical, it can be online. They will go and sit there and they will study all the documents, and then they will prepare a report based on their study that these are the red flags, and this is what happened. That's what happens in a diligence. After the diligence, what is the next step? You decide either you go ahead or you don't go ahead. If you don't go ahead, the matter ends there. If you decide you go ahead, the next step is preparing a share purchase agreement. Now, what is a share purchase agreement? A share purchase agreement is nothing other than a very, it's a standard contract. And that's why I always keep saying, don't get bogged down or confused, just because, terms are different. Share purchase agreement is nothing other than a contract with the same structure. It's the only difference in many of these agreements would be, for example, in an IP licensing agreement, you will have various other, terms included. But the basic structure of all the contracts are going to be the same. The parties, the preamble, the purchase price structure also. So coming back to the share purchase agreement, what happens? In the share purchase agreement, you say that I'm going to buy 100% of your company, or 80% of your company, or 50% of your company, X number of shares at X purchase price. So that is what happens in a share purchase agreement. And that is when you say, okay, I'm agreeing to purchase it subject to the condition that you give me the following representations and warranties. Now, how do you draft your representations and warranties? Representations and warranties always result. There are representation warranties are standard, but there could be additional representations and warranties based on the industry in which you are in. Okay, so representations and warranties typically says that you are law abiding, your financials are correct. Put very simply, typically representations and warranties are 15 to 20 pages long, or it could be even longer. But typically, it's in putting it in very one-liner statements that I am legal, I have a right to sell my shares, I don't have any cases against me, my financials, what I have shown you and what you have read is true and correct. There are no tax cases against me. My IT systems are functioning properly, and I have all rights over this IT infrastructure. I have not taken any licenses, etc., which would put me in trouble, or I'm not using any pirated software. My data privacy is compliant. So these are the various aspects that would be covered in representations and warranties. Basically, you're saying that if any of these things go wrong, I'm going to come after you. You have to, and you'll be liable for any losses which I suffer. Okay. So there are some standard representations and warranties, which are classic and which, run through the lifetime of the contract. So for example, two classic cases which I can say is a right to sell the shares. I think someone has raised a hand.
Sir, my
Yes.
name is Wilson, sir. I just have one doubt regarding contracts.
Uh-huh.
Sir, you mentioned about a non-disclosure agreement. Like that, there's another aspect known as non-compete. Could you maybe tell us more about non-compete aspects, sir?
Sure. Do you want to say that right now, or should I, finish with M&A things so that flow?
No. Yeah, that's fine, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. sorry, where was I? Yeah. So on the M&A aspect, yeah, we have on the representations and warranties. So if any of these representations and warranties are found to be false, then the seller company is bound to indemnify you for that. Now, uh, what was, sorry, I lost the flow. Where was I? Yeah, I was on, okay, the time limit for these representations and warranties. Okay, there are standard representations and warranties. Obviously, when I talk about time limits, all these representations and warranties, okay, have a time limit in the sense that it cannot go on for, you know, eternity. You fix a time limit. And there are some representations and warranties for which there is no time limit, which is always, you know, it will be applicable throughout the lifetime. So one such representation and warranty is, okay, uh, the power to sell and about the share certificates. So typically, one of the standard clauses in this representation and warranties is that the seller is authorized to sell, and these are the number of shares, and they have the corporate right and authority. Now, these are very standard because if you don't have that, the whole transaction is void and the entire money which I paid is void. So these kind of representations and warranties, you know, continue for eternity and they're not limited by time. Now, let's say take the case of a regulatory representation and warranty. Okay, we are not under any investigation currently, or you know, there is no action being taken against by any regulator, and we are not aware of any action which is being proposed. Now, that's a standard representation and warranty. You know, so typically we keep a timeline of 2 to 3 years for such a representation and warranty. If within 3 years nothing happens, it goes away. After that, if something happens, yes, it is our headache, but you keep a timeline of 2 to 3 years. Now there are some representations and warranties like tax representations and warranties, okay, for which there will be a specific timeline. There will be a specific timeline based on the statute. Now, Indian tax statutes, I'm not sure if there is an amendment recently, but typically Indian statutes provide, you know, a 7-year period within which, you know, they can come after you, a 7-year period. So if I'm doing an Indian transaction, I will say that for a period of 7 years or 8 years, the tax warranty will apply to me. So within a period of 7 years, you know, something happens or any investigation comes to the company as a result of an action which has been done prior to my purchase, the seller company will have to indemnify me. So these are representations and warranties, the time limits, and how an indemnity applies to them. Now, one of the, you know, so this is how a typical M&A transaction works. So once a SPA is signed, then there are certain conditions precedent in which he has to be fulfilled before the final share transfer happens. Condition precedent could be anything. One of the conditions precedent could be that, you know, let's say that they have a regulatory issue or a licensing issue. Let's take the example of a licensing. Okay, in the financial services industry, like I said, started off in the beginning, the ultimate beneficial shareholders have to be approved by the central banks in those jurisdictions, in particular in all jurisdictions. So let's say I am taking over a financial services company in India, and I get into an SPA with the seller saying that I'll purchase your company. Now, one of my conditions precedent would be this SPA, completion of the SPA and the transaction would be subject to me receiving all approvals from RBI to take over the shares as ultimate beneficial shareholder. Now, how long would the RBI take? RBI may take 6 months, RBI may take 1 year. From my experience, it's taken more than a year for one of our transactions, may take more than a 1 year. So till that time, you are supposed to conduct, the seller is supposed to conduct the business in a particular manner. So you build around certain clauses which says that, you know, in this period, till these conditions precedent are fulfilled, you're not supposed to, you know, do XYZ activities. Now, those activities could be anything. You know, you cannot incur capital expenditure beyond X amount, you know, X amount. You cannot do this, you cannot do that. Basically, you're putting restrictions so that because your diligence has frozen, you don't want them to do anything further in the business, which involves spending of money or, you know, taking legal risk, which would put my purchase at a risk. So they agree that they will not do XYZ things, and then you wait till the regulator actually approves the transaction. Now, there could be other regulatory aspects involved in it, like, you know, your competition commission. involved also in a transaction. It is quite possible. It's not always necessary. Where does a competition commission come in? A competition commission comes in. Now, let's say, I'm sure you should be having a little bit awareness about what is competition law, where two or more parties come together, with an intent to capture the market or control prices. That is where the competition comes in and tries to regulate these aspects. So let's say I already have two companies, two banks in India, and I may want to acquire one more bank. The market share goes beyond, between these three banks, goes beyond a certain percentage, which is prescribed by the Competition Commission. In such a scenario, I will also need to go to the Competition Commission and get an approval to ensure that I do not breach the law. So it's not just about a financial regulator or any other regulator. It could be about various regulators that are involved in completing a transaction. So that is how typically a transaction works. It may take 6 months, it may take 1 year, it may take 2 months. So that is about how it works. And so, like I was saying, so you wait for that cooling off period, you wait till you get all the approvals. That is when the transaction will finally come to an end. So how does the transaction finally come to an end? When all these approvals are received, parties, message each other saying that these approvals have been received, and then you fix a closing date. Typically, you fix a closing date in the SPA itself, with the provision that if the CPs are conditions precedents are not fulfilled, before X date, you either have an option to terminate the agreement or fix another date to close the transaction. So typically, if it's a very coveted transaction, even though we fix a date, we always keep extending the date to ensure that we do that transaction, however late the approvals may take. So once these approvals are sought, once these approvals are received, then that is where the process of share transfer happens. So, you fix a date, you fix a final date, and on that particular date, money is transferred to the seller's account and the share transferred to the buyer's account, either a demat account or a physical transfer of shares. The transaction ends there. Although the transaction ends there, there could be a lot of issues in between, issues much later, based on your indemnities, based on your representations and warranties, etc. That is post transaction. So there is something called a post transaction integration, where you try to integrate your resources, your technology, etc., with the new purchase company, and that's not something which is quite relevant right now, but that's something which happens. Now, during a transaction, a seller can always give you a disclosure saying that these are my issues, okay, and this is an exception to the warranty. So this is typically how, in brief, how an M&A transaction happens, an acquisition happens. Now there is a concept of a merger in which two or more companies may come together, and only one company will remain, or two or more companies will come together, both the companies vanish and one company remains. So those are all things which you will get to understand once you start your practice. Okay, so I'm getting a reminder. I had a lot to speak about IP and a lot of other things, but I'm getting a reminder from your teacher that time's up. Okay, so yeah, you can ask your questions, please.
And when students ask questions, maybe you can also briefly tell them about the IP policy also, because that might be very interesting for them. Yeah,
sure.
Thank you.
So yeah, you can start your questions. Is that?
Participants, please note that the session is open for questions. You can raise your questions.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah, before that, sorry, I think I missed someone's question on non-compete. Yeah, so okay, one advice to all of you is that don't get bogged down by these terms. Nothing is complicated. Okay, you have Google in front of you. Okay, unlike earlier times where people had to go through a lot of books, hard copy books, hardbound books, and spend time, energy, and effort. Now everything is available at your fingertip. So what is non-compete? Non-compete is nothing typically it happens in an employment context. It could happen. It could happen in a business context. Now let's talk about a business context. And like I was speaking about uh, an M&A transaction. What is a non-compete in an M&A transaction? When I am purchasing a company from you, okay, I'm paying you X amount of money. Okay, you want to exit the business, that's why you're selling the company to me, whatever reasons. Now tomorrow, when I have purchased this company from you, don't use that money to go and start another competing business which competes with my business. Simple terms, that is all. Okay, in an employment context, what it purely means is that while you're working with me, okay, or after you exit my employment, okay, you cannot use my information, etc., to go and start a non-compete. I mean, to start a business which is competing. Typically, in those kind of contracts, it is absolutely non-enforceable because it goes against a public policy. Because if I'm being your employee, and tomorrow I'm out of that company, I can go do what business I want. Okay, so it's against public policy to restrict people who are ex-employees from starting competing business. Yes, you should not be using confidential information from that, for your business purposes, not take clients, etc., from those companies. But technically speaking, you're allowed to you're free to do your business. And if anyone restricts your right to go and start a competing business in an employment context, it is unenforceable. In a corporate context, it purely means that if I am doing something with you, if I am doing a business with you, I don't want you to tomorrow go and set up another company and compete with with me. And while at the employment, in an employment context, while you are at employment of the company, definitely you cannot go and do any other business. You are bound to be, serving your employer. But after your employment is over, you go and do your business. No issues.
Thank you, sir.
Participants, you may raise your questions now.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Sir, so I have a question regarding the CV of a person who is applying for the position of an in-house counsel. So,
Okay.
is there any like specific area where we should give more weightage, like if it's competition or academics, which we should give more weightage?
So if you're talking in the context of a fresher who is passing out of law school, okay, uh, you know, obviously you don't have any work experience per se because you're just passing out of law school, but I'm sure you would have done some internships. You can include those internships and be specific on what you have done. Rather than saying that I interned with XYZ, but what did you specifically do there? That would be one. Number two, on your academics, obviously you have to put where, your marks or whatever you have to put that. But, what would be an added advantage is your ability to do research, to write papers, all these things would be an added advantage.
Okay, sir. So is experience a major criteria? Like, up to what extent a fresher is being hired in an in-house counsel?
Okay, so a very good way to look at it is if you look at LinkedIn and websites like Naukri, etc. Always, you know, uh, very rarely have I seen, freshers being recruited for in-house roles. Okay, very rarely. I'm not saying it doesn't happen; it happens, but it's quite rare. Typically, they ask for 2 to 3 years of experience. Obviously, that's something which we have been challenging. You know, someone has to give you experience for you to have that 2 3 years of experience, right? So, so, so it's unfortunate, but that's how the market works.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Sir, would you advise on doing company secretaryship so as to improve the chances of getting an in-house counsel role?
Okay, so very good question, because in the Indian context, if you look at most of the high-profile legal guys, general counsels, okay, uh, They're more of company secretaries than lawyers. Okay, so yes, if you're a company secretary in India, not just in India, abroad also, you have very good chances, because then you combine both legal and secretarial experience. Okay, when I say secretarial experience, handling board meetings, handling shareholders, on a variety of matters, you can advise, not just being a lawyer. A lawyer may know company law, okay, and he can advise on company law, but and he can also conduct board meeting. But if you're a company secretary, you get a lot of other skills, including accounting, a couple of other skills you get, which will really help you. Having some accounting skills in an in-house role, particularly in the in financial service industry and all, will take you a long way ahead.
So this question
Thank
is
you,
from
sir.
Serafina. This question is from Serafina. In addition to having a law degree, is there any other certification or course we have to take up to gain an advantage as an in-house counsel, or to understand the corporate field in general?
Okay. Now, let me tell you about my experience. Purely for academics, you don't need to do any certification. Okay, you can read it up on your own. Let me give you an example of one of the new areas of law. Not, I won't say new area of law, but which has been existing for quite a long time, but recently has picked up a lot of activity, is data privacy. India has been, I'm not sure about the situation right now, but India has been trying to do that for the last 4 to 5 years, and bills after bills have been coming, but nothing has worked out till now, from what I understand. But data privacy is a very niche area. So, I have done a certification in it, and it's a very interesting subject matter. Because in data privacy, what are you trying to do in data privacy? In data privacy, what you're trying to do is, the private information of a person is very sacred. Now, a simple example would be your Google apps. A Google app will ask you to, ask information from you in terms of accessing all the information from your gallery, your folders, etc. Is that actually required for that app to function? I'm not saying all apps are like that. Some apps are safe, but even apps like Facebook, Google, they take on all your information in an indirect manner, and some apps do it in a direct manner. So what data privacy tries to say is that your information is sacred. And in a corporate context, I'll give you an example. So since a person's information is sacred to him, no one else should be allowed to use that information for providing services relevant to that information, but to not misuse it, share it with others, etc. Now, for example, I want to buy a product from Amazon. So Amazon will ask me for my name, my phone number, and my address. If it's cash on delivery, it will be cash. If it's credit card, it's credit card. You can either save it or, that's all financially sensitive information. So my name, number, and email would be there with my address. Now, what if Amazon sells it to some other guy or passes on this data to someone else? I can be flooded with a lot of junk calls, junk emails, etc. And in many jurisdictions, there is something called a DND, do not disturb. So what data privacy seeks to achieve is protecting the privacy of an individual. An individual's, private space is sacred, and therefore you should not be doing it. And that's why you have concepts like design. So design by default, data privacy by design and default. What it typically means is that you're developing a product. I'm developing an app tomorrow. In order for you to access the app and use certain services, what is the minimum information that I should be collecting? If I have to provide you services through the app, what is the minimum information I should be collecting from you? I may need your name, I may need your number, I may need your email. I don't need anything else. I'm just giving an example. So I cannot, if I ask you for more information beyond what is required for me to provide the services, then it is an invasion of privacy. It's a violation of your private rights. So therefore, when I develop a product, by design and default, I need to have these features inbuilt in it. That what is the information I should take, what is the minimum information I should take, what is that I should be asking you about, and what is that I required to provide the services. Beyond that, anything I ask, I could potentially be held responsible. And particularly in the European Union, ever since the GDPR regulation, one of the strictest regulations, recently they modified it also. Once the GDPR regulations came in, a lot of firms have been fined. Recently, I think it was Facebook, which was fined, Facebook and Gmail, Google were fined by the European Union for millions of dollars. And not European Union, I think by the Irish regulator, Irish data privacy regulator, for millions of pounds for violating data privacy. So data privacy is not complicated. It's not complicated, but it's good to know. Because even in your agreements, you will have elements of data. And data privacy is not limited to business. Even in your context, let's say you're recording this conversation. If you're recording this conversation, you're recording it without my consent. It's invading my privacy. In an office context, if my HR information is provided to someone else or to any other employee, HR information is confidential, right? My name, not my name, my details, my salary, everything is confidential. And those people, certain people are assigned to do it. If they give it to some other employee, my confidentiality is breached. So data privacy has ramifications in our everyday life. This call which we are attending, let's say your professor gives away your information to some other law school, or your CV to, without your consent, takes your CV and gives it to a company. That is violation of data privacy. So it has an everyday, application to our lives. Yes, certifications do help you. Coming back to the question, certifications do help you. It keeps you updated. So there are various courses available, online, how to negotiate, certification in negotiation, certification in alternate dispute resolution, so certification in IPR. So certifications definitely helps you keep updated, and it is good to have that.
Thank you, sir. Participants, do you have any more questions?
Good morning, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, do we have to have experience in litigation in order to take up the role of an in-house counsel?
Okay, don't misunderstand my words. I said it helped me. Okay, I would definitely. So if you're asking me, I would definitely say understand the court process, not in terms of during your coursework, but I would definitely like to see people having that exposure to courts, to actually see what happens. What is written in the books is not what happens in courts. It's a completely different ball game. The strategy is different, the approach is different. Letter of the law is not strictly applicable there. It is applicable there, but there are a lot of surrounding circumstances. Strategy is very important. So if you have that strategy, moving on to an in-house role is, very easy. I'll give you an example. So there was a situation where, I was given the task of terminating someone. Okay. We did the termination from the position of a very important, in the position of very important role. But I knew that there would always be, because of my litigation experience, I knew that there is a possibility that the person may get an injunction. This has happened in India, by the way. Get an injunction order and ask for specific performance, okay, against the termination. Typically, specific performance, injunction, etc., against termination does not happen, and Supreme Court has ruled in multiple cases that specific performance is not applicable, and you cannot do that. If a company doesn't want you, it doesn't want you. Very simple. But again, that is where I said strategy. I knew that because I was a litigation lawyer, I knew that there is a possibility that this person may go to a lower court, get an injunction preventing his termination, and come and sit. So I used to tell my general counsel and CEO that there is a possibility like this, we have to file a caveat. But they didn't think it would apply. Okay. So then what happened was, just as I predicted, he went to a court, a very lower court, and got an injunction. Okay. And he came back and sat on the chair. Okay. So within 2 days, we immediately filed a petition, and went to the High Court, got it vacated, and got a court recorded settlement. So this whole process, I was able to predict and fight off because I had that experience in litigation. If I had been purely an in-house counsel from the beginning, then I would have to think, okay, what is the next step? What is the next step? Because I knew this would happen. In my mind, I was prepared as to what to do if this happens. So that is where it helps you. Again, in terms of risk appetite, risk management, you can identify a problem and you can say, okay, I smell a rat in this. This is okay, leave it. You can decide based on that. So that litigation bent will help you in identifying all these things. But it's not necessary. Okay. Every person has their way of thinking, and every person has their way of seeing how things has to be done. And this is purely my perspective.
Thank you, sir. It's now time to conclude. On behalf of the college, I'd like to invite Gayatri Mohanan, student of Mar Gregorius College of Law, to propose the vote of thanks.
One and all, I deem it a great privilege to propose a vote of thanks on this very inspiring and insightful session. I would like to start off by thanking our guest speaker, Advocate Philip T. Paul, for his highly informative session. It has helped us gain a deep perspective of the role of an in-house corporate lawyer. We are indeed very grateful to you, sir. I would like to take this opportunity to extend my sincere gratitude to Professor Dr. Thomas Kutty PG, Vice Principal, Mar Gregorius College of Law, for addressing us all. We are also very grateful to our Principal, Dr. John PC, and our Director, Reverend Dr. Koshi Isaac Punnamuttal, for giving us this opportunity and platform and for their continued support. I would also like to thank the Center for Internship and Placement, guided by Dr. Liba and Mrs. Sushma. Thank you for your hard work, support, and guidance. I would also like to thank all those who had shared their valuable queries. Finally, I would also like to thank all the attendees for their patient hearing and patience. Thank you, sir.
And if any of you want to contact me privately and ask me questions, feel free to do so. I wanted to tell you a lot more things. I think I could just restrict myself to, M&A and a few regulatory things, but there were a lot of things like information technology, IP, marketing, finance, treasury. I wanted to give you an overview of all these things, which would have been helpful, but unfortunately, there is no time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all for joining with us today. Hope to see you soon on the upcoming webinars.
Thank you.
Philip, yeah, I'm sorry, we have a class after this, which is why I had to intervene.
Yeah. I'll log on.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. It was very enlightening. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful session.
Okay, thank you, sir.